Welcome to the University of Georgia and the local community to today's Constitution Day keynote. The U.S. Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787. The celebration of the U.S. Constitution goes back to 1940, when Americans observed I Am an American Day and later Citizenship Day. Constitution Day was recognized as a federal holiday in 2004 when Senator Robert Byrd presented a bill designating September 17th as the day for citizens to remember and honor the signing of the U.S. Constitution and to reflect on the historical and contemporary importance of that moment for the nation and its citizenry. Today's event couldn't have taken place without the generous support of several organizations both on and off of UGA's campus. Among the sponsors are the School of Public and International Affairs, and I forgot to tell you that I'm the dean there. My name is Matt Auer. SPIA is the academic home for students and scholars of political science, international affairs, public administration, and policy. A special thank you to Lauren Ledbetter, who is with us from SPIA, for helping to organize today's event. Another sponsor is the American Founding Group, a faculty and student discussion group in the Department of Political Science, led by Keith Doherty. Keith is with us as well. The American Founding Group considers topics in political science, political theory, history, law, and economics, among others. Finally, we'd like to thank the Charles Koch Foundation for its generous support of this event and for helping the UGA and Athens communities to honor and celebrate the U.S. Constitution. Our speaker this afternoon is Carol Berkin, who is the Presidential Professor of History Emerita at Baruch College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Professor Berkin was a member of the faculty at Baruch College for more than 3 decades. She earned a BA from Barnard College and a master's and PhD from Columbia University, where she won the Bancroft Dissertation Award. Professor Berkin has won numerous other awards for her research, which is primarily in the areas of American history and women's role in America's colonial history. She's a frequent contributor to PBS and History Channel television documentaries on early American and Revolutionary era history. Additionally, she serves as the editor of the Gilder Lehrman online journal History Now. In her superb 2005 exposition on the creation of the American Constitution, entitled A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, Dr. Berkin remarked on Alexander Hamilton, who was an aide-de-camp to General Washington, bemoaned that so few Americans, quote, think continentally. Professor Berkin writes, quote, his mentor and friend George Washington was forced to agree. When, as commander-in-chief, he asked a New Jersey militia troop to swear loyalty to the United States, they refused. New Jersey, they said, is our country. How exactly did the framers of the Constitution stitch together a national identity among states and citizens who so profoundly mistrusted central authority? And why did the 1790s serve as a turning point? The title of Dr. Berkin's keynote leads me to believe she will unravel some of these mysteries. She will speak on the subject, Born in Crisis, the emergence in the 1790s of an American identity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carol Berkin.
I want to thank you, first of all, for having a podium low enough for me. I have frequently spoken at places where I had to stand on my tiptoes. In my next life, I'm coming back as a 7'2" basketball player. But in this one, 5 feet is about all I could manage. Thank you for inviting me. Though I may sound like a Northerner, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. So if you give me a glass of wine, I will start saying y'all again. Even before the rap musical Hamilton took our nation by storm, Historians had begun to focus a good deal of scholarly interest on the adoption of the Constitution and the first decade of our new federal government. Their work has made it clear that the politics of the 1790s was as divisive and ideologically driven as those we are experiencing today. It was, in fact, a decade filled with crises and conflicts, both domestic and international, many of which would spill over into the next century. Most of the scholarship, however, has viewed these crises and conflicts through a single lens. That is, they've evaluated them solely in terms of the part they played in fostering the rise of our first party system. Thus, everything from the uprising of Western Pennsylvania distillers to the diplomatic failure known as the XYZ affair have been given importance primarily because of its contribution to the emergence of the Jeffersonian Republicans and their challenge to the Federalist power. Perhaps, however, this focus on political party development, important though it is, has obscured as much as it has illuminated. Perhaps it has muted our appreciation of the enormity of those challenges that these crises posed to the survival of a new and still very controversial government, a government that even after ratification of the Constitution was forced to struggle to establish its legitimacy and sovereignty at home and abroad. I often have students who think that as soon as the Constitution was signed, America became the greatest, richest country in the world, and everything was fine. This is what I fought against in this book, this notion. It is a deeper appreciation of the contingency, the uncertainty, and the sheer fragility of our grand experiment in nation building that in the beginning I hope to create and recreate in my book, A Sovereign People. No one understood the stakes involved in this struggle better than George Washington. In his first inaugural address, the president spoke frankly of his doubts that he could effectively oversee the new government's survival. He confessed his uncertainty that he was up to the task of transforming the Constitution's blueprint for a true union of the states into an effective working government. I am, he reminded his audience, unpracticed in the duties of civil administration. But like most of the Federalists he would choose for his cabinet, and the Federalists who served in the first Congresses, Washington was convinced that the effort must be made. For like Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, John Jay, and other men who called themselves Federalists, Washington was a nation builder. Like them, he was convinced that an empowered national government was America's surest path to economic growth and prosperity, that it was the only way to maintain civil laws and social order, that it was necessary to protect the country's borders and to gain that vital respect and recognition from foreign countries that would ensure America's continued independence. Flawed though he knew the Constitution might be, tenuous though the survival of any republic in history had ever proven to be, these Federalists were certain that the Constitution and its government were the best and indeed the only hope for America's survival. Over the next 8 years and into the Adams administration, these men saw themselves as the midwives and as the guardians of the Constitution, and they would labor mightily to ensure the new government's survival. In the end, they made the fatal mistake of confusing their guardianship with ownership, and they proved tragically unable to recognize when their work was done. In A Sovereign People, I look closely at 4 of the many crises of this fraught decade. Each posed a unique challenge, either to the authority of the federal government itself or to American sovereignty and independence from foreign control, or to the legitimacy of the Constitution itself. Yet with the resolution of each of these crises, the country moves slowly toward an affirmation both of the Constitution and its government. The book traces a trajectory of a rising American nationalism, a growing American identity that acted as a centripetal force, finally creating a union out of 13 sovereign nations until the Civil War threatened to tear it asunder. The first of these crises, called the Whiskey Rebellion, challenged the federal government's right to impose an excise tax on distilled alcohol. But in broader and more important terms, the insurgency by Western Pennsylvania whiskey makers was an overt denial of congressional authority itself. Their protest was both violent and well-organized. They attacked government officers assigned to enforce the law, and they intimidated any private citizens in their area who attempted to obey the law. By 1794, they had actually formed an insurgent army, and their leaders were threatening to create a new independent nation on the frontier. The Whiskey Rebels likened their resistance to America's pre-revolutionary resistance to British taxation and tyranny, but the analogy was unfounded. Despite all the liberty poles they constructed and their rhetoric of American federal government tyranny, they were, after all, doing battle against a law that had been imposed by duly elected representatives and not by a government that denied them a voice. President Washington saw it for what it was, a full-blown assault on federal authority, on civil order, and on the Union. He dealt with it with remarkable political acuity and admirable patience. Until I wrote this book, I always thought of George Washington as sort of the lightweight among the founding fathers. Hamilton was brilliant, Jefferson was brilliant, Madison was brilliant, and Washington was tall. Washington was, but as I researched the book, I came to really appreciate his importance and his skill and brilliance in overseeing the first fragile years of the Union. Washington moved methodically because he knew if he acted precipitously, Alexander Hamilton comes into his office and he says, "We've got to mobilize an army right now and crush this rebellion." Washington said, maybe not so much. He knew if he did act precipitously, he would give credence to the lingering and very widespread fears still held by many citizens that the creation of the federal government was nothing more than the creation of a vehicle for tyranny. So Washington took every possible peaceful step toward resolving the crisis. He tried persuasion, legal and judicial procedures, negotiations with the rebels, offers of compromise, until at last he issued the call for militia units from Pennsylvania and neighboring states to staunch the Whiskey Rebellion. In the face of an army of 13,000 men, more than Washington had ever commanded in the American Revolution, the rebellion collapsed. Not a single shot was fired. Few were arrested. And in the end, Washington had the wisdom to issue a blanket amnesty to everyone involved. The first major domestic crisis was over. In his deft handling of the Whiskey Rebellion, the president achieved far more than simply the restoration of law and order. He did diminish the lingering popular fears that a federal government was a certain blueprint for tyranny. At the same time, he sent a clear message that this government would fulfill its obligations to protect its officials and would enforce all laws passed by the people's elected representatives. Now, the public response to his actions was decidedly positive, but this was in large part because of the people's widespread admiration for and trust in George Washington as a man. Thus, their approval was based on a leader's charisma rather than on respect for the office that he held or for the government of which he was a part. It would remain to be seen if Washington's charisma could be transferred to the executive office itself and to the government. The second crisis, the Janae affair of 1793, arose in the middle of the Whiskey Rebellion. It was nothing less than a concerted, blatant effort to bend the federal government and the nation to the will of a foreign power. It began when the French minister, a young zealot named Edmond Charles Janae, he was about 26 years old, arrived with clear instructions from the French revolutionary government to enlist or force America into active support for the French campaign to spread what it called its empire of liberty throughout Europe, a campaign that they were more than willing to use force to ensure. It was French imperialism, and it sparked a major war between France and Great Britain. Federalists immediately recognized the danger in providing the support that Janae was going to demand. His demands were a flagrant disregard for Washington's policy of neutrality. Washington had issued a neutrality proclamation as soon as the fighting in Europe began. And they constituted a broad attack on American sovereignty or independent power. If the U.S. complied with Janae's demands, America would, in effect, be reduced to a satellite or a colony of France. Once again, Washington and his cabinet moved cautiously. The French cause, as he knew, remained very popular in America, and the enthusiasm for the French Revolution had led several state governors already to defy federal authority and American neutrality by providing aid to Janae in his attempts to raise funds and to raise an American army to fight for France. But slowly, and as firmly as it was possible, in the face of one of Europe's great powers, the executive branch rejected Janae's entire agenda. Alexander Hamilton in the Treasury refused outright Janae's demand to make a lump sum payment of all the remaining outstanding debt to France. The cabinet rejected Janae's interpretation of the treaties of amity and commerce that had been signed between the U.S. and France in 1778, an interpretation by Janae that gave France carte blanche to launch naval attacks on the British from American ports and exclusive rights to bring all the vessels they captured into those ports to be sold or refitted as French privateers. In fact, the French, without permission, set up French vice admiralty courts in American port cities to deal with the captured British ships as if America had no say in the whole matter. The cabinet condemned Janae's most outrageous assault on American sovereignty, his campaign to actively recruit an army of Western Americans to join him in invading Spanish-held Louisiana and Florida, and we were at peace with Spain. An increasingly frustrated and impatient Janae showered Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson with letters filled with bombast and threats. Most historians of this era don't expect to be entertained or to laugh, but you should read Janae's letters. They are wild in their claims that France was the sister of America and French blood had been shed for America and Americans wanted to join the French in the war against England. And it got worse and worse and worse and funnier, really, as he became more frustrated. He insisted that the president was thwarting the wishes of the American people. He was certain they stood in firm support of the French cause. The only legitimate voice of the American people, Janae declared, was Congress. Thus, any policies set by the president were nothing more than Washington's opinions. Jefferson tried to school Janae on the protocols of diplomacy and to educate him on the actual division of powers and authority within the U.S. government. It was all to no avail. The French minister grew more strident and demanding as the months went by. The crisis came to a head when it was reported by Pennsylvania officials that Janae was now threatening to appeal over the head of the president directly to the American people. That threat was the last straw. Even the administration's opponents were shocked, and popular support for Janae in France faded rapidly. By October of 1793, Washington felt confident enough to demand Janae's recall. Now, unbeknownst to Janae, a new French regime had come to power that summer that he did not know about, and it proved eager to comply with the president's call for Janae's removal. In fact, its leaders were not interested anymore in managing America. They were only interested in improving the flow of goods and agricultural products from America to their shores because the French people were starving. They were not only willing to recall the young Janae, they were ready to pronounce him a traitor and send him straight to the guillotine. This would have been the young minister's fate, but Washington intervened. With the direct challenge to his policy of neutrality gone, Washington decided to protect Janae rather than see him murdered. He granted the young hothead asylum in America. Janae retired to the countryside in upstate New York. He married the governor of New York's daughter, and he became an American citizen. The Janae affair exposed the weakness of the U.S. on the world stage and the danger that powerful nations would often be tempted to subordinate American interests to their own. But it also put the spotlight on the need for our country to speak with one voice in foreign affairs. By year's end, Americans had decided that the federal government was the appropriate and the only authority that should represent American interests abroad or set American foreign policy. And Janae's threat to appeal directly to the people over the head of the president prompted a widespread expression of support, but this time not simply for George Washington as a person, but for the authority of the executive branch itself. Put another way, the Janae affair had transferred Washington's charisma to the executive branch. Crises involving the French were not over, however. That nation soon took new steps to bully the U.S. into an alliance and thus into a war against Great Britain. By the time John Adams took office, and John Adams, bless his heart, was not as good a president as George Washington was. He was a terrible administrator and had very poor political judgment. By the time he took office, France had stepped up its attacks on American merchant marine vessels carrying goods to the British. Cargoes of captured American vessels were confiscated and sold, and American crews were imprisoned. Only a willingness to give France most favored nation status would end the naval attacks. To deal with this costly assault on American trade and American naval personnel, President Adams decided to replicate George Washington's strategy in an earlier crisis that had involved Great Britain. As the war in Europe intensified, British attacks on American commerce with France had intensified too. By 1794, it was clear that something had to be done to ease the tensions between England and the US. To diffuse the situation, Washington had sent John Jay as an envoy to London to negotiate a new treaty. The Jay Treaty didn't gain much for America, but it did diminish British attacks on American shipping. Now in 1796, Adams decided to use the same strategy. However, he appointed 3 envoys to achieve the same ends with France, but none of the men he chose, Virginia's John Marshall, South Carolina's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and Massachusetts' most irascible and unpopular congressman, Elbridge Gerry, had any diplomatic experience. I rarely talk about modern politics, but I will tell you that Elbridge Gerry was the Ted Cruz of his generation. No one liked him. In fact, when it was heard that Elbridge Gerry, who was John Adams' close friend, Adams was the only friend he had, when they heard who was going, Henry Knox rushed into Adams' office and he says, "You can't do this. This is a guaranteed failure if you send him. He does not play well with others. He is not going to cooperate with the other 2 men. He's a little crazy. Don't send him." So Adams calls Gerry into his office and he says, "Now, Elbridge, some people are worried that you're not going to be cooperative." And Gerry said, "Oh no, I promise I will be." And Adams said, "Fine." That was a mistake. John Marshall, who would later go on to be Chief Justice and have a distinguished career, had really never left Virginia before. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, none of them had any diplomatic experience. They were really babes in the woods. And they came up against one of the wiliest, slyest, most venal men in 18th century Europe, Talleyrand, Minister Talleyrand, who was sly and ran circles around these Americans. He refused to begin any formal negotiations until they agreed to a forced, sizable US loan to the French government, which would have led immediately to war with Great Britain, and to a sizable bribe to Talleyrand. Now, the Americans were horrified by this, but in fact, this was just business as usual with the French. If you wanted to sign a peace treaty, if you wanted to have any negotiations with France, you had to give a little something, something to the minister you were dealing with. Month after month, Talleyrand delayed sitting down with the Americans, and instead he sent a series of unofficial intermediaries who were not even in the government to make his demands on the Americans. They offered veiled threats, not only war against the US by the French Navy, but also French intervention in American domestic politics. Basically, they said, "We will support the Jeffersonians and see that you are thrown out of power if you don't agree to the bribe." They would upend Federalist authority. Marshall and Pinckney wisely refused to bow to these threats or to the insulting demands. Gerry, however, broke ranks with them and began to engage in secret private meetings with Talleyrand. He was hilarious. He would come back to where they were all staying and he would say, I just negotiated something really important with Talleyrand, but I can't tell you what it was. I'm sworn to secrecy. Finally, Pinckney and Marshall have taken as much of this as they can, and Pinckney just explodes at him. And bless Elbridge Gerry's heart, he can't understand why they're mad at him. When President Adams made public, they all finally come home, nothing is established. When President Adams made public the fact that 3 middlemen, who he referred to only as X, Y, and Z, had made bribery a condition for treaty discussions, American indignation soared, and the country began war preparations, thinking France would invade any moment. The American public praised John Adams, and Adams was so happy because nobody ever praised him. He always felt that he was ignored and no one appreciated him, and he got hundreds of letters from organizations and individuals and militia units, and he answered every one of them. He was so happy. They were proud he had stood up to France and asserted American independence. As Americans everywhere proclaimed their determination to stand together in the face of foreign insults, one of the essential elements of nationalism emerged: the recognition of a shared American identity. In every state, North and South, men who had long thought of themselves only as citizens of their own home states now declared their collective identity as Americans. The patriotic toast, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," was more than a response to the French insult. It was a pledge that no disagreement should ever run so deep that it divided Americans one from another, and that no criticism they might have of their government would ever destroy their loyalty to it. And this commitment remained until the challenge of the Civil War. The fourth crisis covered in the book was caused by the Federalists themselves. Despite all the outpouring of praise that the president had received, Federalists knew that Jefferson's opposition party was gaining ground. Using the popular patriotism in what came to be called the quasi-war with France, because they never actually went to war, but the Americans had raised an army and started a navy to prepare for it, they decided this was the moment to strike a blow against the Jeffersonians. They were convinced that the ceaseless, relentless, ad hominem newspaper attacks, and if you think fake news is something new today, you should read the newspapers of the 1790s. They attacked people not only individually. Poor John Adams, they called him fat, they called him short, they said he had bad breath, they were terrible to him. But also they made up out of whole cloth, and the Federalists are about to do X and they're about to do Y. It was all fake news. They believed that these scurrilous attacks, the Federalists did, were eroding the loyalty and respect for the Constitution and for the government they had fought so painstakingly to nourish. It was certainly true that by the summer of 1798, the political skies were darkening for the Federalists. War fever was fading. People were tired of paying taxes for a standing army, and there was no one to fight. Concerns about the cost of mobilizing it had grown. And the continued presence of the army created to fight a French invasion that wasn't happening made many Americans uneasy. Worst of all, from the Federalist point of view, Jefferson's party, which until then had really been located primarily in the South, was expanding. It had once been confined to southern states where slave-based agriculture reigned, but now it had spread to German and Irish immigrants in Pennsylvania, in New York. It had even made inroads into New England, drawing support from Vermonters, New Hampshire farmers, and urban workers. Federalists who clung to the belief that they alone were the guardians of the Constitution and its government confused the possibility of their own decline with the destruction of the Union itself. All these factors combined to prompt the Federalists to an egregious mistake. They passed laws designed to silence the opposition and limit the growth of its voter base. First, they passed a new Naturalization Act that extended waiting time for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. This was to prevent immigrants from France, from Ireland, and from Germany from voting. Then they passed 2 acts empowering the president to deport or imprison dangerous aliens. The Alien Friends Act gave the president the authority to order any aliens from a friendly country out of the U.S. if he found them dangerous. The second, the Alien Enemies Act, gave him the power to apprehend, restrain, secure, and remove. You know, they were all lawyers. One word wouldn't do. They had to have all these words. Not only actively dangerous men from a country we were at war with, but men who he believed might become dangerous in the future. It's telling that in the congressional debates over these three acts, Southern slaveholding Jeffersonians focused their entire concern on the possibility that their slaves would be counted as aliens and as dangerous aliens, and thus the New England Federalists could deport them en masse. This was not the intention of the Federalists, who were sort of stunned by this conspiracy interpretation, but the vocal defense of a state's rights to regulate the fate of alien within its borders was a defense of Southern slavery. Adams' opponents had little to fear from these acts. He never applied either alien law to anyone, and slavery was left untouched. The Friends Act was designed to end at the end of his administration, and the Enemies Act was not put to use until the 20th century. Yet it can't be denied that the threat of imprisonment and deportation had a chilling effect on many of the free white immigrants, especially the Irish intellectuals in America, who were publicly critical of his administration. But the key piece of legislation that did the Federalists in was a quartet of suppression called the Sedition Act. This law made it a high misdemeanor to unlawfully assemble, to conspire against federal laws, to intimidate officers of the government. Its main focus was the Republican press. Anyone found guilty of bringing the government or its leaders into contempt could be imprisoned for publishing or even uttering anything false, scandalous, and malicious. The passage of the Sedition Act, more than any other law, enraged the Jeffersonians. In Virginia and in Kentucky, the legislatures adopted resolutions against what they called an assault on free speech. But these resolutions did more. They reopened a debate over the nature of the Constitution itself. Did it establish a union of the people, or was it a compact entered into by sovereign states? Did the government it create have broad or specific powers? Jefferson was the anonymous author of the Kentucky resolutions, and he argued that the states did not lose their individual sovereignty in creating the Constitution and the federal government, and they remained sovereign in all matters that were not specifically delegated to the federal government. Jefferson wrote, "Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy." The Kentucky legislatures balked at including this in their resolution. Madison wrote a much more restrained set of Virginia resolutions, but he too declared that the Constitution was a compact among sovereign states, not among the people of America. Both states ended their resolution with an appeal to other states to join them, and no other state did. An angry Kentucky legislature issued new resolutions in 1799, and they now said, "The nullification of all unauthorized acts done under the color of the Constitution is our rightful remedy." In this fashion, the concept of nullification entered the political vocabulary of the nation. Now, despite the draconian sound of the Sedition Act, the Federalists' impact on the Republican press and on free speech was minimal. Only 21 arrests were made, only 18 people were indicted. Only 11 of the 17 men and 1 woman indicted ever went to trial, and most of the newspaper editors were released on bail so they could continue to publish their fake news in their newspapers. Those few who were ultimately sent to prison were allowed to spend their time writing damning accounts of the conduct of their trials and continuing to attack the administration. The opponents of the Federalists may have been incarcerated, but they sure weren't silenced. The failure of the Sedition Act was an ironic tribute to the Federalists' respect for due process and the restraints it imposed upon them. John Marshall had observed firsthand in Paris what a truly repressive government was willing to do, but the executions, wholesale destruction of presses, and harsh censorship that filled him with horror in France were not replicated by the legalistic, constitutional Federalist Party. Perhaps the success or failure of the Federalist laws or the Jeffersonian resolution that challenged them is in the end not the most significant measure of this crisis. Instead, this conflict marked an acceptance, a final acceptance until the Civil War, of the legitimacy of the Constitution and the federal government. The men who opposed the Sedition Act did not oppose the government itself or the Constitution. They said they opposed the Federalist interpretation of the Constitution. They supported, they wrote, the Constitution itself and the federal government it created. The tragedy of the Jeffersonians was that they did not realize the destructive potential of their remedies if they were ever uncoupled from a loyalty to the Union. We learned that in the Civil War. The tragedy of the Federalists was that they did not recognize that their mission, ensuring the survival of the Constitution and its government, had been accomplished. Their guardianship of the Constitution had made them proprietary. It led them to conflate the fate of the Constitution with their own fate as its leaders, and to see all opposition to and dissatisfaction with their policies as an attack on the Constitution itself. Their dogged devotion to protecting the government also blinded them to the new hunger arising among common citizens for a stronger voice in politics and a more democratic social order. The Jeffersonians recognized that popular hunger, and their accommodation of it carried them into the White House in 1800. Thank you.